She woke before the first light touched the curtains, the kind of awakening that came not from rest, but from habit. In the quiet of her apartment, she moved with deliberate softness, as if any sudden sound could fracture something within her. The mirror waited for her the way it always did, reflecting the familiar landscape of a face that carried years, choices, triumphs, and small defeats. She studied the way the early light softened her lines, as if the world itself still hesitated before revealing them fully. She lifted her hair slowly, observing the silver strands woven among the darker ones, noticing how they shimmered in the faintest glow. There was a certain calmness in acknowledging what time had etched, not resignation, but recognition. She moisturized her skin carefully, her hands repeating the ritual that anchored her mornings. The sensation was both grounding and bittersweet, because every touch reminded her of who she used to be and who she had become. Her apartment was orderly, curated almost like a gallery of her private life. The plants by the windows thrived under her disciplined care. The shelves held books marked with quiet underlinings, and the kitchen carried the scent of coffee ready to be brewed. Everything around her seemed to whisper the same truth. She had built a life alone, and she had learned to fill it with enough structure to keep the emptiness from growing roots. When she walked to the wardrobe, she considered the day ahead. She picked clothing with the same thoughtfulness she used for everything else, choosing what made her feel dignified and subtly elegant. She had stopped trying to appear younger years ago. Instead, she had learned to dress in a way that protected her softness while revealing her strength. Yet, even with that strength, there was an ache that surfaced sometimes, a quiet question about whether tenderness could still find her. As she sat at the edge of her bed, she recalled old relationships, not with longing, but with the clarity that comes from distance. She remembered the man who had chosen someone younger, not with cruelty, but with the casual inevitability that society praised. She remembered how invisible she had felt afterward, as if the world had unanimously agreed that her time of being seen had ended. The wound no longer bled, but it never disappeared entirely. It existed as a muted bruise beneath her composure. She prepared her breakfast in silence. The clinking of the spoon against the mug was the only sound in the room, a small reminder of how quiet her life had become. She did not resent the solitude, but there were moments, like now, when it pressed against her chest with a weight she refused to name. She had grown accustomed to being the reliable one, the stable one, the woman who never demanded more than what was given. When she finally stepped outside, the cool morning air brushed against her face, carrying with it a promise she never truly believed in. On the walk down her street, neighbors greeted her with polite nods that lacked curiosity or warmth. She was part of the scenery for them, the elegant woman who lived alone, respected but unnoticed. She wondered if they would ever imagine the complexity of the stories she carried behind her calm demeanor. As she reached the corner where she usually paused before continuing her routine, she took a deep breath and centered herself. There was a strange anticipation lingering under her ribs, although she had no reason to expect anything different from any ordinary day. Perhaps it was only the awareness of time, moving forward with its usual quiet authority. Yet something inside her stirred, as though life had shifted by a fraction of a degree without her permission. She did not know it yet, but soon her days would acquire new colors, new hesitations, new breaths held in the space between heartbeats. For now, she continued walking, unaware that the world was already arranging the small coincidences needed for two different timelines to collide. She believed she was simply beginning another predictable morning, but in truth, the path ahead was preparing an opening she did not dare to imagine. When she arrived at her workplace, she straightened her posture and inhaled deeply, returning to the version of herself that everyone expected. Composed, efficient, warm but guarded. She moved through the rooms with practiced grace, unaware that her life, so carefully maintained, would soon be disrupted by something as simple as a presence she did not yet know. Everything still felt familiar, but something subtle inside her shifted, like the first tremor before a larger change. Her routine continued, but her heart registered the faintest interruption in its quiet rhythm, as if sensing the beginning of a story she had stopped believing she could live. The morning unfolded with its usual textures, yet she felt a mild restlessness beneath her ribs, like a soft current nudging her towards something unnamed. She moved through the hours with practiced focus, tending to tasks that demanded precision, yet her attention drifted at unexpected moments. It was as if her day held a quiet hum beneath the surface, a subtle reminder that coincidences sometimes carry more weight than routine. She stepped into the building's shared workspace later than usual, her hands full with papers she needed to revise. The room was bathed in warm light, the low murmur of distant conversations blending with the rhythmic tapping of keyboards. She found comfort in that ambient noise, the kind that softened the edges of solitude without intruding on it. As she entered, she sensed a new presence, not by sight, but by the faint shift in atmosphere that accompanies someone who does not belong to the usual pattern. He was standing near the far table, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, focused on adjusting equipment for a project she knew belonged to the creative department. She had seen young professionals before, but there was something different in the way he took up space. Calm, deliberate, almost quiet in his movements. He glanced up briefly, and their eyes met with the lack of urgency that comes when two strangers acknowledge each other without intention. She looked away first, dismissing the moment as nothing more than courtesy. Still, their paths began intersecting with surprising frequency over the next days. She found him at the coffee machine, absorbed in thought with a notebook open beside him. She found him adjusting lighting equipment near the hallway she often used. She found him crossing the lobby at the same time she arrived or left. None of these encounters carried significance on their own, yet their accumulation formed an invisible thread she could not ignore. He often seemed lost in ideas, but whenever he noticed her, his expression softened in a way that felt unforced. There was no pursuit, no insistence, only awareness. She found herself observing him at moments she could not defend. The way he tilted his head while analyzing something, the patience in his hands as he handled delicate equipment, the quiet attentiveness that contrasted with the chaotic youth she expected from someone his age. She reminded herself that he was 27, a fact that held the weight of a warning. She had built a life sturdy enough to resist illusions, and she intended to keep it that way. Age did not frighten her for herself. It frightened her for what others tended to project onto it. She had lived enough to know that affection from younger men was often brief, curious, or simply enthralled by the idea of what she represented rather than who she was. Yet something about him disrupted her certainty. He treated her presence not as an exception, but as a natural part of his environment. When she offered a comment about a piece he was working on, he listened with genuine attention, absorbing her words as if they carried weight. She felt the unfamiliar sensation of being seen again, not as a mentor, not as an older figure of authority, but as a person whose thoughts mattered. She noticed changes in herself she quietly tried to suppress. She chose a slightly different shade of lipstick one morning, not brighter, just more alive. She styled her hair with more intention. She lingered a moment longer in front of the mirror. None of this was done for him, she insisted internally, yet she felt the tremor of truth beneath her denial. Their conversations remained brief, always woven into the fabric of shared spaces. Yet in those small exchanges, she sensed something unfolding, not loudly, but persistently. The connection did not rush. It grew like a reflection appearing slowly in still water. She found herself anticipating those accidental moments more than she allowed herself to admit. One evening, after most people had left, she walked through the near-empty workspace and saw him gathering his things. The golden hue of the setting sun touched his features, making them appear softened, contemplative. She felt a momentary hesitation, a small pull that urged her to step closer, to say something, to break the invisible boundary that kept everything suspended. But she resisted. Sensibly, carefully. She turned away before he could notice her expression, grounding herself again in the familiar comfort of restraint. She refused to let something so uncertain disturb the life she had spent years fortifying. Yet as she walked out into the fading light, she realized that something had already shifted. It was not grand or dramatic, but it was real. A small, insistent opening in the quiet landscape of her days, created by a man she barely knew, and by a series of accidents that no longer felt accidental. She began to notice how the rhythm of her days changed without her permission. What once felt predictable now carried a softness, an undercurrent she did not name. Their interactions, though subtle, carved small openings in her routine, like thin beams of light slipping through the cracks of a long-closed window. She felt those openings carefully, afraid of how fragile they were. She held them in the quiet spaces of her mind, examining them the way one touches a bruise, with caution, with curiosity, with unreasonable hope. Their connection grew in the shadows of ordinary moments. A shared laugh at something trivial, a glance exchanged across the workspace, a comment about a project that unexpectedly led to a longer conversation. None of it was intentional, yet everything seemed to align with a quiet precision that unsettled her. She lived those moments fully, but afterward she retreated into herself, unsure of what she was allowed to feel. She avoided mentioning him to anyone in her circle. She guarded his presence as if speaking about him would shatter whatever delicate thing existed between them. There was a sweetness in keeping it hidden, but also a tremor of fear. The world could be harsh, and she knew too well how quickly affection turned into target when the numbers between two people did not fit what society tolerated. She was not ready to expose herself, least of all to the cruelty of comparison. He seemed unaware of her internal restraint. When they spoke, he leaned slightly forward, giving her the kind of attention she had not felt in years. He listened without rushing, without performing, without trying to impress her. It was this quiet sincerity that unsettled her most. Not the age gap, not the curiosity of youth, but the way he seemed to recognize her, as if he had been expecting her long before they met. Some days, they found themselves walking toward the entrance at the same time. He would slow his pace as if by instinct, allowing their steps to align. They spoke about small things, work, ideas, films, days that felt too long. But beneath those topics, something deeper pulsed softly. She tried to ignore it, yet it felt unmistakable. The beginning of intimacy not announced, only lived. Still, she kept distance. She avoided situations that felt too exposed. When colleagues invited her to after-work gatherings, she declined politely, unwilling to risk being seen near him outside the safety of shared walls. She feared the way people might look at them, the silent math they would do in their heads, the readiness with which they would reduce her to an age and him to a phase. She had known shame before, not from her own choices, but from the way others had interpreted them. She had felt the sting of being judged for the simple act of wanting something that time supposedly denied her. She had no desire to feel that again. Yet despite all her caution, she felt drawn to him with a quiet inevitability. One afternoon, he invited her to see a project he had been developing. She hesitated before agreeing, telling herself it was just curiosity, nothing more. The room where he worked was dimly lit, filled with screens and sketches and pieces of unfinished ideas. She felt strangely honored to be allowed into that creative chaos. He showed her images, drafts, notes scribbled quickly in ink that had smudged at the corners. She sensed his vulnerability in those unfinished pieces, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. As he explained his process, she observed details she had missed before, the earnestness in his voice, the certainty with which he sought meaning in his work, the gentleness hidden beneath his calm. She found herself wanting to stay, to ask more, to learn the patterns of his thoughts. But the weight of her fears pressed down again. She pulled herself away before the moment could grow deeper, offering an appreciation that felt too formal for what she truly felt. After that day, she sensed a change. It was subtle, but undeniable. They gravitated toward each other more naturally, as if the ground between them had softened. When he saw her arriving in the morning, his expression warmed in a way that pierced through her composure. She tried to hold on to her restraint, yet it weakened each time their eyes met. At home, she replayed their moments together with both tenderness and dread. She scolded herself for allowing feelings to sprout where they did not belong. She told herself he was too young, too unburdened by years that had carved shadows into her. But her body betrayed her doubts. She woke lighter, moved with more intention, felt more alive than she had in years. Still, she kept everything contained. She let their connection bloom quietly within the boundaries she drew. She cherished their closeness but refused to imagine a future. The frontier between secrecy and confession stretched before her, delicate as glass, and though she sensed that he might be waiting for her to take a step forward, she remained still, held back by the memory of every moment the world had told her she was too much, or not enough, simply because she had lived longer. She didn't know it yet, but the boundary she guarded so closely would soon begin to shift, not because of anything said aloud, but because affection, once awakened, rarely agrees to remain silent. The shift became noticeable, not in their private moments, but in the spaces where the world intruded. It started with a whisper of curiosity circulating among the younger staff, a subtle shift in tone when her name was mentioned near his. She sensed it before she heard it. Her intuition had been sharpened by years of recognizing when she was being observed through lenses she did not choose. One morning, she entered the workspace and felt eyes lingering a fraction too long. People greeted her politely, yet their glances flicked toward him with a hint of amusement or speculation. It was a small change, barely perceptible, but she felt it settle on her shoulders like dust gathering slowly on untouched shelves. She had lived too long to ignore such things. She knew when a story was being assembled in the shadows. He, unaware at first, continued interacting with her in the same open way. When he asked her opinion on a design or shared a small anecdote, he did so with the effortless sincerity that had drawn her in. But the room around them began to react differently. She noticed the exchanged looks, the quiet smirks, the murmurs that dissolved when she approached. Each reaction carried the same unspoken equation: her age, his youth, and the assumption of novelty rather than depth. Someone made a careless comment within earshot, not cruel, but thoughtless, questioning why a woman her age would spend time with someone like him. She pretended not to hear, shielding herself with composure. Yet the words burrowed beneath her skin, reviving old wounds she had worked tirelessly to bury. She reminded herself that she owed the world no apology for existing. Still, the sting remained, sharp and familiar. He sensed the tension before she admitted anything. One afternoon, when they crossed paths in the hallway, he paused as if expecting her to say something. She offered only a restrained smile and continued past him. She could not risk letting her inner turmoil slip through. She needed to protect herself. She needed to protect him from her fears. But the situation escalated. Small jokes began circulating among his peers, wrapped in humor thin enough to disguise their cruelty. They wondered aloud whether he had a preference for older women, making the idea sound like a strange indulgence rather than a legitimate connection. They exaggerated the age difference, turning it into a spectacle. And though none of these comments were directed to her face, she felt the weight of each one as if it were carved onto her identity. He grew quiet around his friends after that, withdrawing from their teasing instead of playing along. His silence seemed to irritate them more than any protest would have. They pushed harder, insisting that he was hiding something, implying that he was embarrassed. The truth was the opposite, but she feared that their pressure might change him. Society often did that. It cornered the young until they surrendered to its expectations. One evening, she returned home feeling heavier than she had in months. She sat at her dining table, staring at her hands, wondering how something that had brought her so much quiet joy could so quickly become a source of scrutiny. She had lived too long not to know how narratives could be twisted, and she hated that her presence in his life had become ammunition for mockery. What hurt most was not the comments themselves, but the thought that he might suffer because of her. She could bear being misunderstood. She could bear being ridiculed. But she could not bear being the cause of his discomfort. In the stillness of her apartment, she questioned if distance would be the kinder choice, not for her, but for him. The next day, she tried to create space. She arrived earlier, left sooner, avoided lingering in shared areas. When he approached her, she responded briefly, offering warmth but withholding depth. The change did not escape him. He watched her more closely, confusion crossing his expression whenever she pulled away. Despite her efforts, their connection did not fade. If anything, the distance exposed its strength. She felt the constant pull between what she desired and what she feared. And beneath it all, a quiet truth grew louder. The world had begun shaping a version of their story before she had even allowed herself to believe they had one. He noticed her absence in ways that unsettled him, and though she tried to remain hidden behind composure, he sensed the shift in her presence. She began to understand that what lived between them was no longer contained within secrecy. It had crossed the threshold into the mouths of others, distorted, minimized, misunderstood, yet undeniably real. It became increasingly clear. The conflict ahead would not come from him, nor from her, but from the world pressing against the fragile bond they were still learning to hold. And in that pressure, she found herself confronted by a question she was not ready to answer: whether the weight of their connection was strong enough to withstand being spoken aloud. The morning he asked her to meet his mother began like any other, though she felt a certain hush inside herself, the kind that precedes an unexpected shift. She sensed a quiet anticipation in the way he approached her, but she did not imagine the weight of what he was about to say. When the invitation finally came, simple, sincere, unadorned, it settled in her chest with a heaviness that felt both hopeful and terrifying. She nodded with composed grace, but inside, something trembled like a cord pulled too tight. The hours that followed became a private arena of preparation. She moved through her apartment with a deliberateness that made everything feel significant. She opened her wardrobe slowly, running her fingers over fabric she had worn during different chapters of her life. Nothing seemed appropriate enough for a moment that demanded dignity without pretense. She did not want to appear older than she was, nor younger than she could ever be. She wanted to appear truthful, someone who had lived, who carried her years with honesty, and who was worthy despite the judgments she feared. She chose a simple outfit, elegant and understated, something that allowed her presence to breathe without demanding attention. As she held the fabric against herself, she wondered whether the choice mattered at all. Some people made their decisions before the first handshake. She feared his mother might be one of them, someone who would see her age first, weigh it as a flaw, and dismiss everything else that made her who she was. Her reflection in the mirror seemed suspended between memory and anticipation. She studied her face, the curve of lines around her eyes, the steady calm in her expression, the quiet resilience woven into the way she held herself. She tried to imagine how his mother would perceive her. Would she see the woman he saw? Someone steady, intelligent, luminous in her maturity? Or would she see a threat to the future she envisioned for her son? A deviation from the script she had written long before he was old enough to question it. The uncertainty pressed against her ribs. She placed her hands on the vanity table and inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the rhythm of her breath. She had faced harsher judgments before, survived deeper disappointments. Yet this felt different, heavier. It had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with fear, not for herself, but for him. She did not want her presence to fracture the relationship he had with the woman who raised him. As she prepared to leave, she noticed how her movements became slower, as if each one carried the weight of possibility. She gathered her things meticulously, double-checking small details she normally would have ignored. She paused at the doorway of her apartment, feeling an unexpected ache in her chest. It was the feeling of someone standing on the threshold of a moment that could rewrite everything or undo what had barely begun. On the way there, the city unfolded around her with a strange quietness. People passed by with ordinary urgency, unaware of the storm gathering inside her. She observed their faces, wondering whether any of them carried fears as delicate as hers. She imagined how different life would be if her age were not a factor people measured so ruthlessly. The thought lingered, sharp and unfair, as her taxi approached the neighborhood where his mother lived. The house came into view, traditional, well-kept, the kind that seemed to guard family history behind its walls. She stepped out slowly, feeling her pulse quicken with each breath. He was waiting for her near the entrance, his expression warm but tinged with a quiet strain. She sensed that he, too, was carrying more weight than he admitted. That knowledge softened her fear for a brief moment. As they walked toward the door, she felt the world narrowing to the space between her footsteps, the sound of her breath, the steadying warmth of his presence beside her. She wondered if he knew how vulnerable this made her feel, how rare it was for her to step into a situation where she had no control over how she would be perceived. Just before they reached the threshold, she adjusted her posture, not out of vanity, but out of self-preservation. She wanted to stand in a way that reflected the truth of her life. She had endured. She had grown. She had learned not to apologize for her existence. But even with that strength, she felt the tremble beneath her confidence. She heard movement behind the door. For a brief second, she imagined the moment going differently. Imagined a warm smile. Imagined a curious welcome instead of suspicion. The hope was small and unrealistic, but it flickered nonetheless. As the door opened, she felt the air change. She was about to meet the woman whose approval or disapproval could reshape everything between them. And though she stood tall, though she inhaled deeply and anchored herself in every piece of strength she had gathered over the years, the truth pressed against her heart with painful clarity. Her age would enter before she did. The doorway framed his mother like a portrait painted in restraint. She stood with a posture shaped by decades of expectation, her expression composed yet impenetrable. Her eyes flicked toward the protagonist with a quick, assessing precision, the kind that measured everything without revealing what conclusion had already been drawn. For a moment, the air between them felt thick, like the stillness before a storm that had no intention of being loud, only devastating. Inside, the house carried the scent of polished wood and memories preserved too carefully. Family photos lined the walls, snapshots of his childhood, achievements, moments curated to illustrate a certain narrative of who he was meant to become. She felt like an intruder stepping into that gallery of expectations, her presence disrupting a storyline she had not been written into. His mother guided them into the living room with a gesture so subtle it almost disappeared beneath the weight of her silence. She did not offer a welcoming smile, nor any warmth disguised as courtesy. Instead, she maintained a poised neutrality, the kind that allowed judgment to echo louder than words ever could. Every movement she made was controlled, deliberate, as if she believed that giving too much space to emotion would betray her disapproval. The protagonist sat on the edge of a cream-colored couch, careful to maintain the composure that had carried her through countless difficult moments in life. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, her spine straight, her breath measured. Yet beneath her calm, her heart trembled like a fragile thread stretched too tight. She felt the scrutiny around her, sharp, cold, quiet, wrapping itself around her presence. He tried to bridge the silence with gentle gestures, offering small comments about the house, the weather, updates on work. But each attempt dissolved into the air before it reached his mother. The woman listened without engaging, her responses minimal and clipped, revealing not indifference, but something sharper, rejection crafted to appear dignified. The protagonist noticed details she wished she could ignore, the way his mother's eyes paused on her hands, on the faint lines around her eyes, on the subtle silver strands near her temples. It felt as though the mother were searching for evidence to confirm the story she had already decided to believe. She felt stripped of every layer of identity that mattered, reduced to an age, to a number, to something the world deemed inappropriate beside him. The silence was not just silence. It was verdict, sentence, barrier. At one point, he spoke her name softly, trying to draw her into the conversation, trying to weave threads that might soften the atmosphere. But the moment her name left his lips, the mother's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, as though hearing it spoken with familiarity confirmed her deepest fear. This was not temporary, not insignificant, not harmless. She felt her throat constrict. She offered a polite comment, measured and careful, hoping to find common ground. His mother acknowledged it with the bare minimum of civility, nodding once before letting the moment die. The rejection was not violent. It was worse, refined, precise, controlled. It was the kind of dismissal that came not from ignorance, but from certainty. Time inside that house seemed to stretch painfully. She could feel her composure fraying at the edges, but she refused to let it break. She held herself with quiet dignity, determined not to shrink, even though everything around her urged her to disappear. Her awareness sharpened to every detail, the clock ticking on the wall, the rustle of his mother's clothing as she moved, the soft exhale he released each time the tension spiked between them. When the mother offered refreshments, the gesture felt more like obligation than kindness. The protagonist accepted with gratitude, though her hands trembled slightly as she held the cup. She hoped no one noticed, but she suspected his mother saw everything and interpreted it through the harshest possible lens. The silence grew heavier. His mother spoke to him about family matters without including the protagonist, framing every sentence in a way that subtly excluded her. It was a deliberate choreography of dismissal, executed with precision. She felt each exclusion like a delicate wound forming beneath her skin. At one point, his mother glanced at them, a long, assessing look that made the protagonist feel as though she were being measured for removal. The moment was brief but unmistakable. It left a chill running through her bones. When the visit came to an end, the mother offered a farewell that was polite in tone, but hollow in soul. As they stepped outside, the air felt different, freer, lighter, but also colder. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. He walked beside her in silence, his expression carrying a quiet storm of frustration and sorrow. She did not need to ask how he felt, and he did not need to ask if she had been wounded. The silence inside the house had spoken for all of them. The quiet that followed them home was not the ordinary silence of two people lost in thought. It was a silence shaped by impact, the kind that spreads inward, finding every fragile corner that had been carefully protected until that day. She felt the weight of it inside her chest, a pressure that pulsed with the memory of every glance, every measured nod, every unspoken rejection that had filled his mother's living room. The house had been polite, but the silence had been merciless. When she arrived at her apartment, she stood at the doorway for a moment before entering, as if crossing the threshold would make the day's reality permanent. Her hands trembled slightly when she set down her keys. The composed version of herself, the one she had shown in front of his mother, began to dissolve the moment she was alone. She moved through her home with slow steps, feeling as though each room absorbed her exhaustion. She sat on the couch without removing her coat, her breath shallow and uneven. The silence around her felt different from the silence in his mother's house. Here, it was familiar, a companion she had learned to live with. But tonight, it felt colder, sharper. She replayed every detail of the visit, the mother's distant nods, the way her eyes traveled across her features with clinical detachment, the tension in his posture as he tried to protect her without making it visible. Each memory cut deeper than any spoken insult could have. She had expected skepticism, maybe disappointment, but she had not anticipated the depth of his mother's refusal. It had not been loud nor aggressive. It had been deliberate, sculpted in restraint, delivered through gestures too refined to challenge, yet too cruel to ignore. She had felt erased while sitting in plain sight. As the night deepened, she removed her coat and walked toward the window, letting the city lights blur behind the glass. She pressed her fingertips against the cool surface, grounding herself. Her chest ached with more than humiliation. Beneath the sting was something deeper, fear. The fear that she had stepped into a story she was not meant to belong to. The fear that she had disrupted a future his mother had envisioned with another woman, younger, easier to accept, aligned with expectations she could never fulfill. She thought about him then, about how he had looked at her when they left the house. His expression had been soft, but shadowed by conflict. She had seen the hesitation in his shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the unspoken apology in his eyes. It wasn't his fault, she told herself. Yet the feeling of being an obstacle pressed against her ribs with suffocating clarity. In another part of the city, he sat alone in his own apartment, wrestling with the aftermath. He replayed the visit too, the moments when he tried to include her, the ways his mother subtly cut the threads he attempted to weave. He felt anger simmer beneath his calm exterior, anger at the rigidity he had grown up admiring, anger at the fact that the woman he cared for had been treated as a transgression rather than a person. He reached for his phone more than once, wanting to send her a message, to ask if she was all right, to assure her she had done nothing wrong. But he hesitated each time, fearing that words might sound insufficient, or worse, intrusive. He wanted to protect her, But he sensed that the wound she carried was not one he could soothe with quick comfort. It was a wound rooted in years of being compared, dismissed, underestimated, and he feared that tonight had carved a new mark onto an old scar. Back in her apartment, she moved to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. She lowered her face into her hands, not to cry, but to gather herself. She had survived worse, she reminded herself. She had endured heartbreaks that had fractured her, disappointments that had reshaped her. She knew how to rebuild. But this time, the pain was tangled with something dangerously precious. Hope. She whispered internally the truth she did not dare admit aloud. She cared for him more than she should at this early stage, more than she allowed herself to understand. And the thought of being the reason he faced conflict with his family bruised something inside her that she had believed was long healed. The next morning, she dressed with care, though her movements felt heavier. When she entered the shared workspace, she saw him immediately. He stood by his desk, looking as though he had not slept. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that fragile sliver of time, they exchanged everything they could not say in words. The hurt, the confusion, the tenderness, the uncertainty. He took a step toward her, but before he spoke, she offered a small, composed nod. A gesture meant to reassure him, to keep him from apologizing for something that was never his fault. Yet the nod also created distance, a quiet boundary she hoped would shield him from further pain. They navigated the day in a careful choreography of glances and silences, each one carrying the echo of the night before. They were close enough to feel the connection, but far enough to protect each other from the consequences of acknowledging it too openly. She sensed that something in their story had shifted irreversibly. The silence of his mother had spoken louder than any accusation. And now, every step ahead would be taken with the knowledge that love, or whatever was growing between them, was no longer only theirs to navigate. Some phrases remain unspoken not because they lack meaning, but because the heart cannot yet bear the weight of hearing them aloud. The days that followed unfolded with a tenderness so fragile it bordered on heartbreak. Their interactions retained their warmth, but beneath the surface something had shifted, a subtle gravity pulling them apart even as their hearts leaned toward each other. She felt the change first. It settled quietly in her chest, like a shadow appearing at dusk, long before darkness fully claimed the sky. He still greeted her with softness, still sought her presence with the same instinctive ease. But there was hesitation in the spaces between his gestures, a faint hesitation that had not existed before the visit to his mother's house. It wasn't rejection. It was weight, the weight of pressure tightening around him like unseen hands. She recognized the signs not because he confessed anything, but because she had lived through such fractures before. She noticed how his messages began arriving with slight delays. Not long enough to be alarming, but long enough to reveal that something was twisting inside him. His words were still kind, still genuine, yet they carried the tremor of someone trying to balance two worlds pulling him in opposite directions. She sensed his struggle even when he tried to hide it behind everyday updates. At work, he still approached her, but with a caution he had never shown before. He lingered for shorter moments, glancing around more often, as if the eyes of others had multiplied and grown sharper. The room that once felt like a shared safe space now felt crowded with invisible judgments. She felt them pressing against her skin, reminding her of the difference the world refused to ignore. She resisted blaming him for the distance. She understood too well the pressure of family expectations. She knew that love, or the early tremors of it, could become suffocated when crushed between loyalty and desire. He was young, still shaped by the shadows of the home that had raised him. He had spent a lifetime being guided by his mother's certainty. It would take time for him to understand that her certainty was not truth. But even with this understanding, the changes wounded her more deeply than she let on. She moved through her days with controlled composure, speaking to him with warmth while keeping her heart tucked safely behind her ribs. She did not want to demand anything from him. Demands were the privilege of those who felt entitled, and she had never allowed herself such luxury. She believed that if he chose her, it needed to come from a place untouched by pressure. In the quiet of her home, the ache grew fiercer. She sat in her living room at night, the dim light casting soft shadows across her face. She held a blanket around her shoulders, not for warmth, but for grounding. Thoughts of him drifted in and out of her mind, delicate and dangerous. She wondered if she should step back for his sake, wondered if loving him, even silently, was unkind. Every possibility felt heavy, but none heavier than the fear of losing what they had barely begun to build. Meanwhile, he lived through days marked by conflict he refused to voice. His mother's silence had followed him home like an echo that refused to fade. She had hardly spoken during the visit, yet her disapproval had etched itself into every corner of his mind. He struggled with guilt that had no rightful place, yet grew in him nonetheless. He feared hurting his mother, but feared losing her even more. And beneath all those fears was another more painful truth. He felt unworthy of asking the protagonist to endure the consequences of being with him. He began doubting himself, not his feelings, but his strength. He wondered if he could shield her from the scrutiny, from the whispers, from the judgment that would inevitably spread. He worried that his youth, once something she accepted with quiet grace, now became a barrier rather than a bridge. The distance formed slowly, like water gathering between two shores. Neither of them spoke of it, neither named it, yet both felt it deepen with each passing day. They still shared moments, still exchanged glances filled with tenderness, but the world around them had become a stronger presence than the bond between them. Some nights, she felt the distance most acutely when she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She listened to the steady rhythm of her breath, wondering when exactly hope had begun intertwining itself with fear. She wished she could hold on to the early days, the unguarded smiles, the accidental moments of closeness, the softness in his gaze when they crossed paths. But reality had shifted, and as she closed her eyes, she sensed a truth forming inside her like a quiet confession. Sometimes distance does not begin between two people. It begins inside one of them, growing from the weight the world places on love that does not fit its expectations. The tension inside him grew in the quiet moments, the moments when no one was watching, when he could no longer pretend that everything was unchanged. The pressure from his mother, though delivered without raised voices or dramatic ultimatums, pressed against him with a weight that felt almost ancestral. Her silence had been sharper than any spoken prohibition. It lingered in the corners of his apartment, in the pauses of his routine, in the spaces between breaths, and it forced him to confront a truth he had tried to postpone. The two worlds he cared for were now colliding. He spent long evenings sitting at his kitchen table, hands clasped, staring at nothing while his thoughts pulled him in opposite directions. On one side stood the woman who had raised him, who had shaped his sense of responsibility, who believed she knew what was best for him. A woman who lived by the certainty that her experience should guide every major decision he made. On the other side stood the protagonist, whose presence had become a quiet anchor in his life, a source of steadiness and depth he had not known he needed. He replayed their time together in vivid fragments, the calm strength in her voice, the way she listened with genuine attention, the warmth that radiated from her even when she tried to hide it behind restraint. With her, he felt seen in a way that stripped him of the superficial roles the world expected him to play. She recognized his fears before he voiced them, noticed his fatigue before he admitted it, understood his hesitations without needing explanations. There was a maturity in her affection that made him feel both grounded and expanded. But then came the memory of his mother, the tightness in her expression, the rigid posture, the unspoken verdict in her eyes. She had not needed to articulate her objections. The disapproval had been woven into every gesture, every pause, every refusal disguised as formality. He had grown up respecting her, admiring her strength, but now he saw the shadow of control behind that strength, a belief that she had the authority to define which kind of love was acceptable and which was not. He tried to imagine a future where he complied with her expectations. It seemed neat on the surface, a predictable story with no friction, no conflict, no raised eyebrows at family gatherings. But when he pictured a life without the protagonist, a hollowness expanded inside him, an emptiness so visceral he felt it settle behind his ribs. He realized then that obedience to expectations had never brought him fulfillment. It had only shaped him into someone afraid of disappointing others. He thought of her sitting alone after the disastrous visit, bearing wounds she would never show him fully. He knew her silence had not meant indifference. It had meant pain, fear of losing what they had barely begun, and an instinct to protect him even at her own expense. The thought of her suffering quietly because of him tightened something inside his chest until it ached. One night, he stood on his balcony, watching the city lights flicker like distant constellations. The cool air pressed against his skin, grounding him. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel the truth without excuses. He cared for her, not as an escape, not as a novelty, but as someone who brought out the most honest parts of him, someone whose presence had become essential to the rhythm of his days. He knew he was at a crossroads. Continuing in silence would tear them apart slowly, with neither of them daring to name what was happening. Confronting his mother would be painful, perhaps even transformative. But the decision had to come from a deeper place than fear. It had to come from the part of him that wanted to live his own life, rather than the life already scripted for him. He imagined the conversation he needed to have with her, the firmness he would need to hold, the calm he would need to embody. He knew she would resist, not irrationally, but with the conviction of someone who believed love should come with rules and timelines. He would have to explain that those rules no longer belonged to him, that his happiness demanded a different shape than the one she envisioned. As he sat back down at the kitchen table, he placed his hands flat against the wood, grounding himself. A clarity began forming inside him, steady and resolute. He could not change his mother's beliefs, but he could choose how much power they held over his life. He could not erase her disappointment, but he could refuse to drown beneath it. What he felt for the protagonist was not something he wanted to hide or diminish. It was something he wanted to protect, nurture, and stand beside, even if it meant stepping into conflict for the first time in his adult life. He took a slow breath, closing his eyes as the decision settled fully into place. It felt like the quiet click of a lock opening inside him. He was ready, not because he sought rebellion, but because choosing her felt like choosing honesty, choosing courage, choosing the life that made his heart expand rather than shrink. Sometimes, the only way to honor one's past is to stop letting it dictate the future. The day he chose to face his mother began with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. The city moved around him with its usual noise, but inside his chest there was only a steady, unwavering pulse. Not comfortable, but resolute. He walked toward his childhood home with the heaviness of someone carrying both love and conflict in equal measure. The air felt dense, as though the world were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. His mother greeted him with her usual composed grace, but her eyes held a question, a suspicion formed from the aftermath of their previous encounter. She gestured for him to sit, and he did, feeling the weight of years settling on the space between them. He had spent his entire life shaped by her expectations, her meticulous guidance, her certainty that she knew what stability looked like. But today, for the first time, he felt an internal shift, a quiet rebellion rooted not in anger, but in selfhood. He began speaking with calm restraint, careful not to let emotion dictate his words. He explained that the woman she had met was important to him, that their connection was genuine, that her age did not invalidate the depth of what they were building. His voice remained steady even when his mother's expression tightened with subtle disapproval. He could see her searching for arguments, reaching for the familiar weapons of future expectations. Children, longevity, appearances, social perception. But he continued, not aggressively, but with a firmness she had never seen in him before. He told her that he valued her opinion but could not allow that opinion to dictate his life. He spoke of the tranquility he felt with the protagonist, of the stability she brought him, of the emotional maturity he admired in her. And he said, with a clarity that surprised even himself, that he was not asking for permission. He was informing her of his choice. His mother's silence became heavy, oppressive. She tried to argue, her words laced with fear disguised as practicality. She told him he was too young, that he was being impulsive, that he was confusing admiration with affection, but he held his ground, gently dismantling each argument without raising his voice. For every objection she offered, he responded with a sincerity she could not shake. This relationship made him feel alive in a way that aligned with who he wanted to become, not who she expected him to be. When he left the house, his legs felt weak, but his conviction remained firm. He knew the conversation had not changed her mind, but it had changed something inside him. He had finally spoken with the full weight of his own adulthood. He no longer felt like a boy seeking approval. He felt like a man choosing his path with consciousness and courage. Across the city, she sat in her apartment, unaware that he had faced the storm for her. She prepared herself for loss. She folded laundry with careful hands, packed away dishes, and moved through her home with the quiet efficiency of someone preparing for goodbye. She had spent the previous night telling herself that stepping back would save him from conflict. She believed that the kindest thing she could do was let the connection fade before it grew strong enough to harm him. She rehearsed a message she intended to send, something gentle, respectful, expressing gratitude for their time together while creating distance. She tried to imagine the life he would have without her, a life more aligned with what the world expected of him. The thought carved a slow ache through her ribs, but she accepted it as a necessary choice. She would absorb the pain quietly. She always had. That evening, he arrived at her door without warning. The sound of his knock startled her. She opened it cautiously, expecting hesitation, confusion, perhaps even regret. But what she saw was something entirely different. He stood with a calm intensity she had never seen in him before. His face carried signs of exhaustion, but his posture held purpose. She sensed immediately that something had changed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His presence alone felt like an answer to every fear she had nursed silently. He stepped inside, not with urgency, but with quiet resolve. She could feel her heartbeat rise, unsure of what he had come to say. She braced herself for farewell, prepared to nod gracefully, to let him go with dignity. But as he looked at her, a truth settled into the space between them. The truth that he had chosen clarity over comfort, courage over compliance. He had chosen her, not by impulse, but by conviction. He did not need to recount the conversation he had with his mother. She could read the aftermath of it in the tension of his shoulders, in the softness of his gaze, in the silent assurance emanating from him. He had faced the silence that had been meant to separate them, and he had refused to be guided by it. In that moment, she realized she was no longer standing on the edge of loss. She was standing at the beginning of something defined not by permission, but by choice. Sometimes, a single voice is enough to break a silence meant to control everything. The morning after he came to her door carried a softness she had not felt in years. It was the kind of quiet that settles after a storm. Not empty, not fearful, but full of a fragile calm that invites careful breathing. She woke slowly, allowing the stillness to move through her limbs, unsure if the sense of safety she felt was real or only a remnant of a dream. But when she remembered the look in his eyes the night before, steady, certain, unwavering, the calm inside her deepened. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the light stretch across her skin, illuminating the faint lines on her arms, the gentle mapping of time on her body. For the first time in a long while, those signs did not feel like a verdict. They felt like evidence of endurance, of growth, of a life lived with depth rather than speed. She touched her face gently, not to erase anything but to acknowledge it. She felt older, yes, but not diminished. The night before had shifted something fundamental. She no longer felt like she was borrowing a moment that did not belong to her. When she stepped into her living room, she found him standing near the window, looking at the city with a contemplative posture. He turned when he sensed her presence, offering a quiet smile, not one born from relief, but from recognition. She approached slowly, feeling the distance between them shrink in a way that no longer frightened her. There was no rush, no urgency in the air, only truth. They shared a quiet morning, moving through the apartment with an ease that felt almost sacred. Nothing needed to be defined. Nothing demanded explanation. The simple fact that he was there, fully, intentionally, was enough. His presence no longer felt like a fragile possibility. It felt like a decision living itself into existence. Later, when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. He told her that the conversation with his mother had been difficult, but necessary. She did not ask for details. She did not need them. She saw everything she needed to know in the softness of his shoulders, the grounded quality in his gaze. He had faced the world that shaped him and returned unchanged in his commitment. Still, she felt the lingering ache of the tension that lay ahead. His mother would not transform overnight. Resistance would remain, subtle, perhaps, but persistent. The world around them might continue to question, misunderstand, or diminish what they shared. But for the first time, she felt capable of carrying that weight without bending beneath it. Not because she had grown stronger, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. They spent the following days adjusting to this new landscape, a terrain where affection and conflict coexisted, where tenderness walked beside uncertainty, where hope had to be practiced rather than assumed. She found herself learning to breathe again in his presence, to trust the moments without waiting for them to be taken away. He, in turn, began discovering what it meant to choose rather than seek approval. He introduced her to small pieces of his world, not all at once, not as a display, but as an invitation. A cafe he liked, a bookstore that had shaped his childhood, a street where he often walked to clear his mind. Each place carried a different meaning now. They were no longer fragments of his private life. They were shared spaces where they could exist without hiding. Yet the shadow of his mother remained in the background, not hostile, but watchful. Her silence had softened slightly since their confrontation, but approval was still far from reach. Sometimes he felt the weight of it pulling at him, tugging at the edges of his confidence. And during those moments, she offered him the steadiness he had always offered her, not by persuading him, not by arguing against his mother, but simply by being present with a calm that came from years of surviving her own storms. Over time, his mother's resistance shifted into reluctant acceptance. Not warmth, not endorsement, but recognition. She realized that her disapproval did not dissolve the connection between them, nor did it weaken her son's resolve. What once felt like a threat became gradually an inevitability she could not control. She greeted the protagonist with polite restraint, and while those interactions were far from comfortable, they were no longer suffocating. The protagonist did not attempt to win her approval. She understood that some hearts take longer to open, and some never open fully. But she refused to diminish herself to ease someone else's discomfort. She carried herself with quiet dignity, offering respect without sacrificing self-worth. She allowed the mother to adjust at her own pace. She knew that the only acceptance she needed, the only one that shaped her future, stood beside her with unwavering loyalty. Months passed, marked not by dramatic triumphs, but by small consistencies. Shared meals, long conversations, quiet afternoons, the slow weaving of two lives previously shaped by solitude and expectation. What grew between them was not fragile. It was resilient. It did not ignore age. It did not pretend it did not matter. It simply refused to let age dictate the narrative of what two souls could find in each other. She looked back on her life before meeting him and saw a landscape defined by caution, by withdrawal, by years spent believing that her time for being chosen had passed. Now, standing beside him, she saw a different truth, that the heart does not follow the calendar. It follows recognition. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the buildings and painted the sky with muted gold, she stood with him on her balcony, feeling the breeze touch her skin. He took her hand gently, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke of everything they had endured, everything they had chosen, everything still unfolding. For the first time, she felt time not as an enemy counting her steps, but as a witness walking beside her, not against her, not against them, but in favor, quiet, steady, patient, as their story continued.